Welcome you to City of God today. If you're new, it's so good to have you with us. My name's Eric. I'm one of the pastors here. We have Matthew 14 this morning. So if you have a Bible and want to turn there, Matthew 14, the text will also be up on the screen. We're having a transition between, as Pastor Tim mentioned, our summer series through the Apostles' Creed. And next week, we will kick off our new fall series that will take us throughout this school year. Typically at City of God, we preach through books of the Bible. We're going to be working through the book of Hebrews together over the course of the next few months, which I'm excited to do. It's been on our list to do for a long time, and I'm glad we're finally getting around to it. Secondly, as Tim mentioned, if you are a college student, our college ministry is having its kickoff here in a couple of weeks. Make sure you go to the website, check the Church Center app, register for that event. Let us know that you're coming, and we would love to have you come and check out our college ministry with us. So, again, Matthew 14. We're going to pick up in verse 22 here in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and assume that most of you didn't spend any time thinking about bristlecone pine trees this week. I'm just going to throw it out there. Although this is the one room, there may be somebody sitting here who's like, I'm actually writing my master's thesis on this. And you could correct 100 things I'm about to say. I know there's at least one biology professor in here. So I found this online. That's what it is. Send factual corrections to tj@cogchurch.org. So let us know. But here's what I discovered. Bristlecone pines grow in the western mountain regions of the U.S., sometimes as high as a mile or two above sea level. These evergreens may live for thousands of years. The older specimens often have only one thin layer of bark on their trunks. Considering the habitat of these trees, such as rocky areas where the soil is poor and precipitation is slight, it seems almost incredible they would survive so long or even at all. One author writes, though, the environmental adversities, however, actually contribute to their longevity. Cells that are produced as a result of these conditions are densely arranged, and many resin canals are formed within the plant. Wood that is structured in this way continues to live for an extremely long period of time. One researcher said bristlecone pines in richer conditions grow faster but die earlier and soon decay. It's the harshness of their surroundings that's a vital factor in making them strong and sturdy. Another researcher went on to say, bristlecone pines generally compete poorly in less than harsh environments, making them hard to cultivate. In gardens, they quickly succumb to root rot. They do very well, however, where most other plants cannot even grow. The reason I was thinking about this at all, or bring this up this morning, is because I actually think this is a really helpful picture of the Christian life. These trees that we just read about thrive in the most difficult and stressful conditions, and when their environment is comfortable, it actually kills them. And in many ways, I think the same thing can be said of following Jesus. Again, I talk to many Christians, and I've experienced periods like this myself, where it feels like their faith or their growth in the Christian life has grown stagnant. They aren't seeing a lot of spiritual fruit in their life. They're finding it hard to worship or to be excited about spiritual things. Maybe when they open Scripture, it feels like a chore and nothing excites them as they read. Maybe they're at a point where they're questioning if God is real at all. Or maybe it's just a season where you know the things that Jesus has called you to do, but obedience to Jesus is just hard and not happening right now. If you've been a Christian for any length of time, you've probably felt like this at some point. I know I've had seasons of life like this. Maybe you're there as you sit in the room right now. And there might be a number of reasons why you're feeling this way, but I'm going to throw out one possibility this morning. Again, not the only answer to this question, but one possible one. For some Christians, they are struggling to grow. And the reason they don't feel like they're getting any closer to Jesus or looking more like Him is because they've put themselves in an environment that isn't conducive to spiritual growth. What does that mean? Think back to what we just said about these pine trees. In many ways, the more adverse and challenging the environment, the stronger and healthier those trees become. And when they're in an easier and more comfortable environment, their growth is stunted. And I think the same thing is true of the Christian life. That when many Christians remain in an easy and comfortable environment, it's difficult to grow spiritually because those aren't the conditions that produce spiritual growth in our lives. Now, maybe you're not sold on this idea yet, but let's jump into Matthew 14 and see how this played out in the life of the disciples. Now, as we open this story, Jesus has had an exhausting couple days of ministry leading into this. He's recently found out that one of his best friends, his cousin, John the Baptist, was just executed. And as he finds out this news and tries to grieve what he's heard, crowds just come around Jesus asking for his help. And Matthew tells us Jesus had compassion on the crowds, and he healed them, and he taught them, and he cared for them, even in the midst of his own grief. And eventually he cares for them so long that it's dinner time and the disciples tell Jesus, send them away so they can go eat. But Jesus takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and he multiplies it, miraculously feeds 5,000 people. And so he's emotionally exhausted over this news he's just heard. He's been giving himself to these people for hours and hours and hours. And so it's not surprising that in such a busy season of ministry, Jesus wants some time alone with God. Pick up in verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Now, this isn't the main point of the sermon, but it's worth noting here. One of the things I'm always struck by in the Gospels is how often Jesus retreats from the crowds to spend time alone with God. It's less prominent in Matthew's gospel, but in Luke's gospel, Jesus is constantly retreating from ministry to be with God in between intense periods of serving others. And if Jesus needed those regular, quiet moments with God to empower and prepare him for the works that God had given him to do, how much more should we try and cultivate a similar rhythm in our life? Now let's turn to the main point of the story. In many ways, what we're about to read is actually a really helpful picture of the Christian life, and it gives us a pattern that we can seek to follow as we try and follow Jesus. And this story begins where all of the Christian life begins. Jesus gives a command, and the disciples respond in obedience. Jesus tells the disciples, get into a boat and go to the other side of the lake ahead of him, and the disciples respond. They do what Jesus told them to do. Now, this doesn't seem like a huge deal, but let's start here as we think about our relationship with Christ. One of the key components of the Christian life is Jesus calls and we respond. This is how the Christian life begins. Jesus invites us to respond in faith to him, and we respond. We see this play out in the lives of the disciples. Matthew 4. In verse 18, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. Again, Jesus calls, and he leaves the response in the disciples' court. Andrew and Peter and Andrew hear this invitation from Jesus, follow me, and they have a decision to make. Jesus says, leave behind your family and your business and everything that you've known and follow me. And the disciples have to decide, will we respond? The disciples are faced with the decision in our story. Jesus says, get into the boat and go on ahead of me. Jesus commands, will the disciples respond? Now, at some point, you heard an invitation to give your life to Jesus, and this is where your Christian life began, if you're following him. Jesus invited you to respond in faith to the gospel, and you made that decision to respond. But this isn't just the beginning of the Christian life, it's the constant of the Christian life. Jesus calls, we respond. Jesus teaches, Jesus commands, and we respond in faith. And it's possible that one of the simplest reasons you're not experiencing spiritual growth or intimacy with Jesus right now, maybe is this: you've just simply stopped listening to his voice or stopped responding in obedience to his word. If that's our reality, it shouldn't surprise us if our spiritual growth feels stunted. But that's not the only thing that can slow our progress in the Christian life. In our story, the disciples do quickly respond in obedience to what Jesus commands, and yet the decision they make to respond in faith to what Jesus commands actually puts them in a pretty dangerous situation. Pick up in verse 23. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. The disciples again respond to Jesus. They get in the boat, they head to the other side of the lake, and they quickly find themselves in the middle of a dangerous storm. And when the storm hits, we discover they're actually in a pretty bad place on the lake. From the other Gospels, we know this lake's about 5 miles wide. They're 3 to 4 miles into their journey across the lake. And so, putting yourself in their shoes, this storm hits. They're about 3 to 4 miles into the journey. And on either side of the boat, there's at least a mile between them and land. There's not a quick and easy way to get to the shore at this point. And so again, put yourselves in the disciples' position. They're in the middle of this lake on a boat. A massive storm is raging around them. There's not an easy path to the shore. And I'm sure as some of the disciples thought, this is the moment we die. This is the end of our lives. And yet, if they had stopped to think about it, the only reason they were in the middle of this storm is because Jesus told them to get into a boat and go across the lake. What we discover is this: they're in this storm, they're in this position. Why? Because they were obedient to Jesus' command and they followed through with what he told them to do. This is important because one of the easiest ways we can slow our spiritual growth is to assume that any hard thing, difficult thing, any uncomfortable situation that we can step into can't be from God, because God would always want our lives to be comfortable and convenient and peaceful. If that's the conclusion we've come to, and it's easy to fall into that mindset, we're not getting it from the Bible. Because when you look at the men and women of God in Scripture who were closest to Jesus, often their lives were filled with difficult and hard and uncomfortable things. And once we understand this, it'll radically change the way we approach the Christian life, especially when we think about or we're wrestling through the idea that if we respond in obedience to Jesus to something that he's calling us to do, and it would make our lives more difficult, then it can't be from him. Because what we discover in this story is this: often it's in the midst of our greatest difficulties and struggles, it's in the midst of the biggest storms we face in this life, that actual spiritual growth happens in us and through us. And Jesus knows this, and he loves us too much to allow our lives to remain easy and comfortable. The disciples are in the middle of a storm because of Jesus, and Jesus wanted them in the middle of a storm. Some of us are facing some difficult things in this life, and we're asking, has God forgotten about me? And the reality is, you're actually right where God wants you to be right now. Because, and we're going to see this throughout this story, there are some lessons that God can't teach us, and some lessons we will not receive unless we find ourselves in a difficult place. Jesus' brother James seemed to understand this when he wrote in James 1, 2 through 4, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Now, the very first line of that passage sounds crazy. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. That's not our natural response to trials, and you might be asking the question, why would James say this? Christians aren't masochists. We don't go looking for difficult things, but when they come, James says, count it joy. Why? Because there's spiritual growth that happens in the midst of trials that doesn't happen anywhere else in our lives. Because James says it's in the midst of trials when our faith is tested, and when we persevere in the midst of those trials, that steadfastness is born in us, that faithfulness to Jesus is born in us, that perfection, he says here at the end of this, is worked in us. Some of you are getting ready to walk into some trials over the next few weeks and months. For some of the students returning or coming to college for the first time, you're about to enter a season of trial. Your faith is going to be intellectually tested in some ways that it never has before, and you're going to wrestle with, do I actually believe these things? Or your convictions are going to be tested as hundreds of opportunities and temptations come your way this semester. For others in the room, your faith is being tested by a painful season or situation you're in right now, and there's nothing wrong with feeling grief and hurt over that. But in this story, we recognize that maybe, not always, but maybe, the reason we're facing these things isn't because Jesus has forgotten about us. Rather, it's right where He wants us to be so He can grow and stretch us in ways that we would not grow in a more comfortable situation. Look at how this happens in the lives of the disciples here. Verse 22. We're going to back up and look at the opening of this because notice this. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. Notice the language here from Matthew. Jesus didn't ask the disciples to get into the boat. He knew a storm was coming, and He made the disciples get in the boat. Another way to translate this word is He compelled the disciples to get into the boat. Again, He's Jesus, so we assume He knew that if they got in the boat, they would be caught in a storm, and yet He sent them anyway. And as we continue to walk through this story, we do discover something profoundly important about progress in the Christian life. As we said earlier, Jesus knew there were some lessons He could not teach the disciples, and that there were lessons the disciples would not learn unless they found themselves in an uncomfortable and difficult situation. What we see throughout the Gospels, and I'm guessing many of you have experienced this in your own life, is that the greatest spiritual growth occurs when we're in a situation we can't handle on our own, when things feel like they're out of our control, because it forces us to trust God and depend on Him in ways that we normally don't. And Jesus knew that for the disciples to be the people He was calling them to be, He was going to have to send them into a few storms throughout their lives. Now, we can acknowledge that as a fact, but it's hard to receive that as a reality because, again, the common assumption people make is if something in their life is hard, it can't be from Jesus because Jesus would never make someone's life harder. But as you read the Gospels, what is Jesus constantly doing? Making the disciples' lives a lot harder. As you read through the Gospels, Jesus regularly sends the disciples into difficult and hostile situations. He regularly puts them in positions and gives them tasks to accomplish that they can't accomplish on their own. He sends the disciples to preach to people that He knows are going to be hostile to their message, and He sends them out onto a lake in the midst of a dangerous storm, knowing that they're going to be in trouble. But there's a purpose to it. We begin to see this in verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, He came to them walking on the sea. Matthew notes that at this point, Jesus finally comes to them, and it's the fourth watch of the night, meaning it was between 3 and 6 a.m. at this point. So again, imagine you're the disciples. You've been fighting this storm all night at this point. It's dark, you're scared, you're exhausted, and on top of all of that, all of a sudden you look out, and someone is walking towards you on top of the water. And it's hard, you can't really fault the disciples for their reaction in verse 26. When the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Their initial thought is, this is some spirit that's come to us, and there was apparently a lot of people in the first century who believed that if someone passed away in a particular body of water, then their soul would endlessly hover above those waters, haunting it. That's what they think is happening here. Now, Jesus quickly explains to them that's not what's happening, verse 27. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, don't be afraid." Now, I'm not sure that the disciples realized the significance of this in the moment when they were sitting on the boat terrified. But what we see in verse 27 is this: Jesus is revealing who He is to the disciples in a couple of profound ways in verse 27 that are easy to miss. First, we read Jesus approaches the disciples by walking on the water and coming out to them. Now, this is a miracle, but it's more than just a cool trick that Jesus performs here. Because there's no other story in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, of someone walking on water like this, but there is one person in Scripture who is described as walking on water. And it's God. We see this in the book of Job, chapter 9, verses 5 through 8. We also see it throughout the Psalms, this kind of language. But as Job thinks about the greatness of God, he says, "He who removes mountains and they know it not, when he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun and it does not rise, who seals up the stars, who alone stretched out the heavens," and then this phrase, "who alone trampled the waves of the sea." We see it in the last phrase there. We see it throughout the Psalms that there is one in the Bible who is claimed to trample the waves of the sea, and it's God himself. But that's not all that Jesus is doing here. Once Jesus gets close enough to the boat, he cries out to the disciples, "Take heart, it is I, don't be afraid." Do you know, if you translated that phrase literally, do you know what Jesus is saying? I don't know why they don't translate it. Literally, here's what Jesus is saying. Take heart, I am, don't be afraid. Now maybe you're thinking, I've heard that. Where have I heard that before? In Exodus chapter 3, this is the way that God introduces himself to Moses. Exodus 3:14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." I want you to notice what's happening here. Jesus is walking on water to meet the disciples, and when he gets close enough for them to hear him, he yells out, "Take heart, I am." And over the course of their time with Jesus, the disciples slowly begin to realize who Jesus is. And up to this point, we don't know exactly what they thought about him, but at least he's a great teacher, he's a prophet, he's a healer, he's a mighty man of God. And yet, as they see him walking on the water toward them and proclaiming that I am, one of the things that might have been rolling through their heads is this: is it possible this is actually God himself? This is a huge realization for the disciples to come to, whether they realized it in the moment or as reflecting on this. And the only reason they could come to this realization was because they were caught in the middle of this storm. There were things they learned about Jesus in the middle of this storm through Jesus coming to them and rescuing them that they could not have learned had they stayed on the shore and not gotten into the boat. Without the storm, the disciples wouldn't have been in an environment to learn these things about Jesus. And just like the disciples, sometimes obedience to Jesus is going to lead us into some difficult situations. Peter experiences this individually in the second half of our story. One of the disciples recognizes that Jesus is with them, and once they realize this, Peter cries out from the boat, and Peter answered him, verse 28. "Lord, if it is you, command me to walk out on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Again, what's happening here? We see Peter, Jesus commands, Peter responds. Peter steps out of the boat into a very scary situation. Jesus tells Peter to come to him, and Peter puts his foot down on top of the water and begins walking toward Jesus. And I want you to think about this for a second, that in this moment, Peter finds himself attempting something he never would have tried on his own. Why would he? It's impossible to walk on water. But Jesus tells him to do it, and Peter responds, and in an instant finds himself doing something he never dreamed he would have been doing in this life. Now, throughout our lives, Jesus is going to call us to do some things that might feel equally impossible. It might feel like trying to walk on water to do these things, to share our faith with those around us, to pursue holiness and root the sins out of our life that have been a constant struggle, to be a generous person with all the resources that God has given us, to use the skills and gifts He's given us to love and serve others even when we don't feel competent or qualified for the task. And we could go on and on with a list like this, but Jesus regularly calls His followers to do scary, seemingly impossible things. Throughout the New Testament, Jesus commands His disciples to do things that feel impossible. Jesus had some hard commands. Commands like love your enemies. and turn the other cheek, and don't worry or be anxious, and deny yourself and take up your cross, and rejoice when you're persecuted, and forgive people over and over and over again. Again, these things can feel impossible to us. They can make us feel like we'll never be able to follow Jesus. But what we discover throughout this story is that it's in stepping out of the boat. It's in taking a step of obedience that feels impossible that leads us to encounter Christ's presence and power in ways we never would have had we remained on the shore and not stepped out of the boat. And as we think through what this means for us, often we're afraid to take that step of faith, to be obedient to Jesus, because the question we ask is, what if we fail? What if we try and respond to Jesus' call and we fall on our faces? Thankfully for us, that's exactly what happens to Peter here. Because in verse 30 we read, when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Now, at one level, it's possible to read this as a failure on Peter's part. For a moment, he listens to Jesus' command. He responds in obedience. He does something he never would have been able to do on his own. And then in an instant, he falls on his face. He begins to sink. He takes his eyes off of Jesus. And this is the same thing that often happens to us when we respond in obedience to a hard thing that Jesus is calling us to do. We begin to follow Jesus. We step out in faith, and then things start to go crazy around us. We start to take our faith seriously, and then bad things seem to happen, and we take our focus off Jesus. Or we try and talk to someone about Jesus, and it doesn't go well, so we just give up. Or we decide we're going to get serious about the Christian life, and then temptation ramps up in our life for some reason, and eventually we give in, just like we did all of the times before, and we feel like failures, and we give up even trying. Again, Jesus is calling you and me to do and be more than we can do and be on our own. He's calling us to step out in faith and do the very things that He did. But the only way we can accomplish these things, the only way we can actually look more like Jesus, is if we keep our focus on Him, as Peter did at the beginning of this story, is to keep our eyes on Him. And yet, when we do that, when we take a risk for Jesus, when we step out in faith, we are going to fail. It's not going to go perfectly. And it's going to be easy for us to assume that risk, that step of faith was a waste. It would be easy to look at Peter's story here and assume what Peter did here was a waste, because in the end, he sank. Again, Peter might have failed here, but this was far from a waste. Because what we're seeing here is the nature of Christian discipleship. Jesus calls, we respond, we do it imperfectly, but the next time we step out in faith, we do so a little bit more confidently because of what we learned the last time we did this. We learn a little bit more about Jesus every time we step out in faith. We learn a little bit more about what He can do in and through us every time we step out in faith. Yes, Peter sank, but think about what this moment did for the rest of his life. How important do you think it was for Peter to remember that he walked on water and Jesus rescued him when he was sitting in a Roman prison for the sake of the gospel? Another storm, it looks different, but Peter's remembering, the last time I was in a jam like this, Jesus was faithful, so I can endure in this one. Or how important was this moment when he stands up to preach the first Christian sermon in human history in Acts 2? Or when he's at that moment where Peter himself is being nailed to a cross, as church history tells us, because of his faith in Jesus. Peter knew, because of this imperfect moment, this seeming failure, that he could do and be so much more than he could on his own if Jesus was with him. And I truly believe this imperfect moment allowed him to do things throughout the course of his life he never dreamed. Yes, he sank, but he also remembered, I did step out on the water and walk on it, and Jesus did rescue me, and he kept doing these kinds of things throughout his life. Because Peter stepped out in faith and realized that through Jesus he could do more than he ever imagined. It allowed him to keep moving forward when other storms came into his life. If you and I step out of the boat and follow Jesus' commands, we're going to fail sometimes. It's going to happen. But in those moments, in those storms and failures, we will still experience the power and presence of Jesus in ways that we never would have had we not taken that step of faith. Because the disciples got in the boat and found themselves in the middle of a storm, they saw Jesus in a new way. Because Peter stepped out of the boat and walked on water toward Jesus, even though he failed, he experienced Jesus in a new way. And when you and I step out in faith and do the things that Jesus has called us to do, we might sink. We'll likely fail many times, but we might also encounter God in those moments in ways we never would have had we not taken the step. This is the environment where spiritual growth happens. When we live and take risks that we can't accomplish on our own, it forces us to trust in Jesus and depend on Him in ways we never would have had to otherwise. Look at what this encounter did for the disciples as we close, verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped Him, saying, "Truly you're the Son of God." Again, because the disciples obeyed Jesus' command and got into the boat, even though it led them into a storm, it brought them to a place of worship they had never been before. It brought them to a place of praising Jesus where they were praising Him in a way they never had before. I don't know why you're going through the hard things you are right now. And if you seek to be obedient to Christ, it's going to put you in some uncomfortable situations. But if, like the disciples, you're willing to persevere in those difficult moments, if you're willing to cling to Christ and trust Him even when it's difficult, you will experience God in a new and fresh way. The band can come up and we're going to get ready to sing. When I think back to my own life and the times that I've gotten closest to Jesus, it was never when life was easy. It was those moments when in the early days of our marriage, Jesse and I would get to the end of the month and we'd be out of money and we weren't sure how we were going to pay the bills in a couple of days. That made me get close to Jesus. Or when we faced really painful relational issues. Or when we were fearful over the well-being or health of a loved one. Or when we stepped out into faith into something Jesus was calling us to do, like starting this church when we weren't sure if it would work. And at the beginning it looked like it might not work. Now, do I want to go through those things again? No. If you gave me the option, would I choose to bring those things into my life? No. But I would never change the fact that they happen. Because it was in those moments that I learned to be more dependent on Jesus, to be desperate for Him, to trust Him, and to humble myself, because I realized in these situations, I can't change my circumstances, and Jesus is the only one who can. And when God finally brought us out on the other side, it brought us to a place of worship. We had a greater sense of Christ's love, a greater appreciation for His power and plan, and we had a deeper sense that we could trust Him. Obeying Jesus is going to lead you into some storms in this life, and Jesus might even send you into a couple Himself. But it's because He loves you. Because if you're willing to step out in faith, even though it's painful, there is growth that's going to happen. There are things you're going to learn and love about Jesus that you can't receive any other way. What would it look like for you to take that step of faith this morning? We're asking that as a church right now. We feel like God is calling us to take some risks and to step out in faith to try and accomplish some big things in this city. And you're going to hear about that in the coming weeks and months. They're risky things that we're thinking about, but we feel like God is calling us into those things. What would it look like for us to step out in faith together? And as Christians, may we not resist the hard things that come from following Jesus, but embrace them as the very place where God may want to do His greatest work in our lives. I'm going to pray, and we'll continue to worship.